Trek warp drive.
All right, so I turn in this sound effect of this Enterprise going from warp 1 to warp 7. That particular sound effect winds up being the sound of the Enterprise, and it gets me sort of a career as a Star Trek sound effects specialist. So I went on to do 6 more Star Treks, always being number one. Anything to do with the Enterprise was my domain because I had the secret formula, and then expanding to everything else. So whether it's lasers or planets falling apart or who knows what. I mean, just all the stuff that you can't record with a microphone. And remember, this is before samplers. So get on the synths. They said, well, that's great, but that's electronic. Can you give us organic sounds? And that's what they were used to work with. So one of the things I acquired was a TAC 8-track half-inch deck with some DBX on it. And that became my main sampler palette. So I modified the machine. It had a vario speed on it. So I modified the machine, changed some resistors. So it actually come from dead stop to 30 IPS continuously. So I had this tape recorder go, so that became my tool for, quote, sampling. So I would now make tape recordings and put them on this half-inch 8-track and, put multiple tracks on it and then be able to run the whole thing, re-record it back to a quarter-inch deck. And so that was, my supply chain to them was, and then when it came to loops, I had real loops. I mean, the quarter-inch going through mic guides around the room, 60 feet of tape going around with a splice in it to make these long loops and then re-record those back into the 8-track. So it was a lot of re-recording. And in this case, the DBX helped a lot in the noise reduction on the tape. And so that became my main act. So it was the 8-track TAC with all the stuff on it, a bunch of quarter-inch decks, and then my fleet of synths, which at the time we had the 2 ARP avatars. We had an ARP Quadra. I had a sequential circuits 700 programmer hooked to the avatar. And actually, this avatar back here is the original machine. That guy stayed with me since. And I modified it to have control voltage and triggers for all the parameters. So I do external envelopes from the programmer, external control voltages for tuning. So it became a programmable, basically Odyssey, but that was one of my main axes. And then I also had a ARP 16-channel sequencer. So between the sequential programmer and the ARP sequencer, they both ran on the avatar. So I had this sort of ARP world. And then the Prophet 5 was still one of the key pieces, which I now inherited from the world of Weather Report, bringing now to the movie business. And one of the big things about the Prophet 5 was it was the first programmable in that you could record a sound. So everybody in the movie business was used to somebody coming in with a module or something or a bunch of knobs, and you could never get the same sound twice unless you really, document it. So now you could save it and use it. So that became very useful. So I became very popular because I was a guy that was creative, but also able to deliver and repeat himself, as a resource. So the interesting part of the journey now is the picture editor from that first Star Trek movie, a fellow named Todd Ramsey. His next movie is Escape from New York. So he's now gone, Star Trek's done. He goes on to his next movie. He's the picture editor, but I had been giving him tapes of, promoting myself, giving him cassettes of my music, and he saw what I was doing for Star Trek. And at the time for Escape from New York, John had worked with a fellow named Dan Sound Arts, and then with Dan, he had done the original Halloween and The Fog, and whatever scheduling issues, and John was looking around for what else out there. So John Carpenter to me and said, hey, you guys need to get there. I bet you get along famously. So back to the same studio now with all that same gear, my Star Trek room. John Carpenter comes over one afternoon, and I play him some sounds and some of my music, and he's just kind of sitting there like taking it all in. So at the end of that hour and a half, he goes, okay, let's do it. And that was it. That was my commitment from John Carpenter to, you be my guy. Let's come on over. I'll do my movie with you. So my first film score was now Escape from New York. So
let's talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind. Let's stop here because Escape from New York is definitely, one of my personal favorites and Mike's as well.
Yeah, I'm still a huge fan of that movie. And
I own it. I own several copies of it, and we watch it. And one of the things that is so striking about that is the moods that you set with that. Stylistically, from a movie standpoint, it looks really, really good. But and they did some amazing things on the budget constraints. From what I understand, that they did some of the matte paintings and stuff were actually done by some very famous people. But the mood that you create in that movie is so, it just grabs your attention.
And it still works to this day because, you know, we're so used to seeing everything with like all the new digital, you know, processing and the CGI and all this other stuff. And then you watch this old, you know, movie from 1980s where obviously you don't have all the CGI, you know, you have the stuff that was painted on. And then, but really, you know, it still creeps you out. Like, it still makes you think like, holy shit, like, what if that actually did happen? Like, what if, you know, a city was sectioned off, and what would it feel like to be dumped in there, you know, where it's just like there are no laws. You're just in there with nothing.
So
that music just still holds. How did you like
comprehend and get that feeling across of that, you know, dystopian kind of sound, but it's also kind of in a weird way comforting, I guess you could say. I mean, can you take us a little bit through the creative process of that and what you were thinking about?
Sure. Well, again, John Carpenter is, I'm getting feedback from you guys right now. So John Carpenter is John Carpenter. He arrives, he's already envisioned this movie, he lived this thing already. He's now through, you know, I'll say somewhat difficult production. It's time to do his music. He likes me. He comes over. It's our first time together. We sit down. You know, we had vinyl at that time, or cassette, so we put on some vinyl. He played me. He had me listen to a Police album. He thought there might be some interesting stuff in the Police, and it had a little bit of a iconic thing with, you know, stuff like that. And then we played some Tangerine Dream. So those were two things we identified as things that he liked. So I just took that in right away. Go to my rig, and I start dialing up stuff. Now, he doesn't want to know anything about the technology. All he wants to know is where's the black and white notes. So I'm going to push those notes. But we do play guitars too. So he plays guitar. So we had my Stratocaster and a precision bass there too. So that was that palette. And then going into the project, right simultaneously, that is the first Linn drum. The LM1 is like, again, I've heard about this instrument. I got to find. Literally, I go over to Roger Lynn's garage. Roger, I got to have one. And you know, and he doesn't know me from anybody. I'm just another guy. Probably the weather report card was what got me in the front door. So I now, of course, you know, pony up, buy a Linn drum. So now I've got the Linn drum now I'm going to use that as the master clock for the sequencers, for the ARP sequencers, and for the sequential sequencers as the master clock of the whole rig. And the clock output is from the Linn drum, but they only sync a thing called FSK that you have to record to the tape recorder. So now getting the whole rig working the way I wanted it to work meant that I had to record the Linn drum FSK down one track of the multi-track. And then anytime you wanted to do anything, you had to start at the top of the cue. Even if you're going to work at the last 4 minutes down, you had to stop at the clock again and let the whole thing run so you picked up the right clock pulses all the way down so everything would come back up in sync. So it's kind of a pain in the butt.
So Smart FSK hadn't hit yet, then I take it.
Right, and SMPTE was not relevant to this so far. There was no, it was before MIDI. There was no MIDI. We were you know, I was, but I'll reflect for a second. When you don't have everything you need and you have to invent, it puts you down certain paths of discovery. Like, I'm going to have to figure this out. I can't buy one of these. I can't go to the Guitar Center and buy a software solution. I have to think and I have to invent, et cetera, et cetera. So the pioneering part was something I really enjoyed. You know, being the first kid on my block to have to crack this thing open and make it work. And I still do that even today. I'm on another project it's the same way right now. We'll talk about later. And so I put up my palette, but it's John Carpenter's movie and his music. So he's the lead in this stuff. So I dial up in the sequencer, you know, bump, 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 bump. And I set a little bass for him to go ahead and put something on top of. So in this case, the sequencers go first and then Carpenter plays on top. There's other cues where music is so simple that you kind of like, you skip over it. Like, there's nothing musical about that. But when you put it with his movie, it's perfect. And this is what you guys were talking about. What was created was a custom build for that movie. And I'd say for me, and we've talked on this before, I was an artist. I was, a painter, sculptor guy that sort of got bit by music and ran away with the circus. But now when I was put back into a situation where I'm going to now make sounds for images, I'm an image guy. So when I watch things, I hear stuff right away. I mean, what it's supposed to sound like is already in my head based on the picture. So as opposed to in the band business, writing, 3-minute hits to try to be on the radio, when I was finally asked to make this art for movies, this is where I found my peak. This is where who I am became relevant versus all the other stuff that was floating around before that in bits and pieces. It kind of crystallized. So sat down with John. We started again on that first A track, and on the A track in the beginning, and then kind of John looks up and he goes, we're going to need some more tracks. So I scouted around, and we're in Los Angeles, so there's rental gear. So I rented a 24 track that was a portable one, because it happened to be where I lived. It was up a bunch of steps, and it was just a pain in the ass to get in and out of there. So it was a Stevens portable 24 track, which I then set up on a couple saw horses, just added to the rig. And now I went from an 8 track to a 24 track, which is now this much bigger palette of tape recorder to play with, a lot more tracks. But again, the sequencing is not like what we know today, where you would dial up and quantize. You had to play this stuff. So there was takes and retakes and overdubbing on your stuff, and you had to actually play. It wasn't quantized Nirvana. In some ways, that's part of what you hear is the humanistic squirmings and the emotions that come from being a little behind the beat or a little ahead of the beat. We still got a clock thing in the sequencers, but the performance on top of that is guys playing. And so overdubbing were for real. And because I was very track limited, everything was in mono. I mean, it was a mono synthesizer to a mono track. I don't want to waste tracks being in stereo. That came much later, when we could get to MIDI and play 8 synthesizers at once and then put them 8 things down on one stereo pair. That's how we solved that problem. So that was kind of where it started. And then, back to the sampling synth, like in the very beginning, when you're going up the wall to just see the first reveal of the city, and you hear this thing, that's me taking an acoustic piano, which I had in the living room, and going in and doing music concrete with it, right? Going in and fooling around and banging on the thing and opening the thing and yelling in it and coming up with weird textures. And that was part of the sound design part of, besides synths, putting organic things into the score. And like I said, we had the guitars, so we played the guitars on stuff. And so that was the seed. And so it grew. It grew organically while the movie was being finished. And we dealt in a linear fashion. So we started at the beginning and went to the end. And I remember getting to the end of the movie going, golly, I don't know what they were going to do next. Like, I'm spent. And then you just get in there in another afternoon and you start building on what you already had, and more stuff comes out. And, eventually we finished it.